Today is May 30th, 2003. This is Kathy Lang. I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, interviewing Ambassador John Dolibois. Mr. Ambassador, tell us please when and where you were born.
Well, to begin at the beginning, obviously, I was born in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Now, when you mention Luxembourg to many Americans, they don't know where that is. So we have to explain to them that Luxembourg is an independent, small country, 999 square miles between Belgium, France, and Germany, in the heart of Europe. In fact, Luxembourg has been referred to as the green heart of Europe. I was born on December 4th, 1918, just a couple of weeks after the signing of the armistice, which ended World War I. I was born in a community of Luxembourg, actually a suburb of Luxembourg City, which is the capital of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, known as Dolibois, which is French, means the good road. And that was significant. Also, predestination. I was born on the Rue Chicago, long before there was even any thought that someday I would be coming to the United States. So being born on the Rue Chicago in Luxembourg was significant in that respect. I'm the youngest of 8 children. And I was born, as I said, in December. 10 days after my birth, my mother died of the epidemic of Spanish grippe that was going around the world. My sister had fallen in love with an American soldier from Ashcan, Ohio, who was billeted in our home. My sister was the oldest of the family. She was 19 years old. And she planned to get married to this American when the war ended and he was released from the army. But as I said, I was born, my mother died, and that changed my sister's plans. Of necessity, she had to take care of me, and also being the oldest in the family, she had to take care of the rest of us. With the result that she had to give up the thought of marrying the American and coming to the United States. But as it turned out, they were really in love, and they corresponded for the next 10 years. And in 1929, Albert Felton came back to Luxembourg to marry my sister and bring her to the United States, to Ashcan. Meanwhile, my other brothers and sisters all got married, had their jobs. They were considerably older than I was. I was 13, and my father decided that there wasn't much of a future for me in Western Europe, since Hitler was coming to power, and my father had the good sense to anticipate what was going to happen in Germany. So we decided we would come to the United States as immigrants. So my father and I came to the United States to join my sister in Ashcan, Ohio. I couldn't speak a word of English at that time, which of course made it very difficult when the time came for me to go to school. They had difficulty deciding what grade to put me in. I couldn't even understand the instructions for the test they gave me. With the result that the principal and the teachers at Findlay School in Akron, Ohio decided I should be in kindergarten. Now if you're 13 years old and you're in kindergarten, that's a rather traumatic experience. I was the biggest boy in class, so nobody ever picked on me. But as it turned out, I spent 3 months in kindergarten and then was promoted to the 3rd grade and finally ended up in the 6th grade by the end of the semester. I've always been grateful to the teachers and the principal of Findlay School in Akron for taking that step, because from there on in, all through high school and college, English was my best subject. So I think that's the way to go. I also feel that if you're an immigrant coming to the United States and being able to benefit from all the freedoms and opportunities that our country has to offer, the least you could do is learn the language. So I have a very prejudiced feeling about that. I think everybody who comes to the United States as an immigrant ought to learn the language first. That's very important in my way of thinking. As it turned out, then I graduated from Akron North High School and was very fortunate in getting a scholarship to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And just a week before my graduation, I was working at a gas station in Akron, Ohio. Actually, I was on a night shift, which was really a wonderful thing because it gave me an opportunity to study while working in the gas station during the night, interrupted only occasionally by a customer. And on one of those occasions, one of the customers drove in, was a schoolmate who had a young lady with her to whom she introduced me, and I decided that's the girl that I was going to marry. So we met in the gas station, Pure Oil. The slogan was, "Be sure with Pure," which is a very good introduction. So I met Winnie Engelhardt. We had our first date the night I graduated from high school, which was a significant occasion because I was the president of the class and valedictorian, so I managed to make quite an impression on my girlfriend on the first date. We decided to go to Miami together, and we made plans accordingly during the summer of 1938 rather, and of course we did go to Miami University together and graduated in 1942. My first job after the war, after 1942, after we graduated from Miami, was with Procter & Gamble, right here in Cincinnati, as an industrial engineer with P&G at Ivorydale, and just a short mile from where we are now. That was my first job, and I held that job, of course, until the draft board got a hold of me in November of 1942. I reported to Fort Thomas, Kentucky, which was the induction center for this particular area. And I'll never forget the very first time I appeared before the personnel section to be assigned to wherever they wanted to send me. A young PFC sat behind the table there, and he asked me, "What can you do, Dolibois?" I'd heard my name mispronounced. So I proceeded to correct him. That was the first mistake I made in the Army. But in answer to his question as to what I could do, I told him that I was born in Luxembourg, and I could speak French and German fluently, and I'd like to get into military intelligence. He said, "Did you ever drive a truck?" I said, "No, but I can speak German fluently. I wasn't going to give up so easily." Then he said, "How about a bus or a tractor or a plow or something heavy with air brakes?" And again I said, "No, but I can speak German fluently. I'd like to get into military intelligence." Well, he had different ideas. My minute and a half was up, and the next day I'll find myself on a troop train on my way to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where the Army proceeded to make a tank driver out of me. So I was in the Armored Force Replacement Training Center at Fort Knox, and I spent my 3 months of basic training learning how to drive every vehicle in the Armored Force and how to fire every weapon in the Armored Force. And I did so with a certain amount of enjoyment. I should say, meanwhile, my wife and I had married. My girlfriend Winnie and I had married, and she stayed on in Cincinnati while I was at Fort Knox finishing my basic training. I qualified for OCS, the Officers Candidate School. And that happened to be right at Fort Knox also. So I became one of those 90-day wonders, going through OCS for 90 days, 3 months, and received my commission in 1943 from no less a person than General George S. Patton, Jr. And General Patton was the commanding officer of the 8th Armored Corps at that particular time, and he was the commencement speaker when we graduated from OCS my commission was in the cavalry, mechanized cavalry. There were 8 of us out of the class who qualified for cavalry, and because Patton himself, of course, was a cavalry officer, we had the honor of having General Patton pin our swords, our crossed swords, the cavalry insignia on our uniforms. And I thought that was a very interesting beginning of my military career. Of course, at that time, General Patton was not as famous as he became later, but it was a significant beginning of my career. Incidentally, Patton had also given me my first demerits. In OCS, if you got 2 demerits, 21 demerits actually, you were kicked out. So everybody tried not to get any demerits. But out of that class, there were 2 of us. I remember David Filipino. David Del Pino, he was from the Philippine Islands. David and I had become good friends, and as it turned out, we were the only 2 who, in the whole class, who by the end of the first 9 weeks had not yet received any demerits. So we were rather proud of ourselves. In fact, we were getting rather cocky, thinking that, well, we're going to be setting a new record. We're going to go through OCS without any demerits. But the sergeant who was in charge of our barracks said, the midterm inspection is going to be made by General Patton. And when he makes the inspection, everybody gets demerits, because General Patton was tough. So we decided, well, we were going to outsmart General Patton. As it turned out, that Saturday morning, General Patton came through, and the first part of the inspection was the barracks inspection. He checked our foot lockers, our beds, where we kept our clothing, checked for a spot of dust across the windowsill, and I passed the inspection. But my friend Del Pilar got his first demerit. The general asked him, how many pairs of socks in your foot locker? And Del Pilar didn't know. He guessed 11 pair. The general said 7 pair, 2 demerits, improper inventory. The second part of the inspection was uniform inspection, and we both passed it without demerits. And the final part was the rifle inspection. And now I knew I had it made because my rifle really was clean. And I came to present arms. General Patton grabbed my rifle and turned it upside down and cocked it open, looked through the barrel, grunted, closed the barrel, threw the rifle back at me. And then curiously and mysteriously, the nickel that we always kept in the rifle to hold the spring down when it didn't have any ammunition in it, that nickel mysteriously popped out and landed at my feet. And the general looked me in the eyes and he says, what is it, heads or tails? I bent my head, said, tails, sir. He says, 2 demerits, moving in ranks without permission. So I caught a glimpse of a smile on his face when he went on. And behind him, our sergeant winked at me and he said, I told you, everybody gets demerits when General Patton makes the inspection. So that's an aside that added substantially to my memories. I was to meet General Patton again on several occasions. And as it turned out, at Christmas time, 1945, I happened to be in Luxembourg and was able to witness the burial of General Patton, who was killed in an automobile accident, and now is in a grave at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, the head of his troops. Anyhow, when I graduated from OCS, I went into what was called battle training, a very intensive course of 1 month of actually going through battle training. The use of live ammunition and really simulating battle conditions, a very intensive training. Then I expected to be sent overseas, but instead I was sent to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, which is now Fort Chaffee. Incidentally, Elvis Presley did his basic training at Camp Chaffee, so it's one of our national shrines. I went to Chaffee as a second lieutenant in the mechanized cavalry and was assigned to the 23rd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, mechanized. We were the scouting unit, actually the reconnaissance unit of the 16th Armored Division, which was a new division just being formed at Camp Chaffee. I knew that I would probably be at Chaffee for a couple of years, and my wife and I decided this would be a good time to start our family because we expected to be at Chaffee quite some time. Then lo and behold, out of the clear blue sky, somebody stuck a pin in the right hole, and the Army found out I could speak German fluently. With the result that on 3 hours' notice, while we were on maneuvers in Arkansas, I was sent to Washington, reclassified, and transferred to military intelligence, which is where I wanted to be in the first place. But it took 18 months to reach that particular point. Now my whole military career changed. I didn't know where I was going when I arrived in Washington. And they put me on a bus, and the next thing I know, we went about 60 miles north, and I ended up in Camp Ritchie, Maryland, which was the secret military intelligence training center. They assigned me to a Section 5 for specialized training in what became known as IPW, Interrogator Prisoners of War. I was to attend a 2 months training course, during which I learned the psychology of interrogation. I had majored in psychology in college, Miami University. And I think that's one of the reasons, in addition to my being able to speak the language, one of the reasons they put me into the IPW section. But we learn how to interrogate people, the psychology of interrogation. We learn about the German Army organization, the military ranks, the classification of weapons and vehicles in the German Army, what is known as order of battle. And of course the technological terms of the weapons and the arms used by the Germans, the organization of the German Army, and what little we knew at that time about the rise of National Socialism, the characteristics and the personalities of the high-ranking Nazis. At the end of this very intensive training course, I expected to go overseas as an IPW officer to interrogate prisoners taken on the battlefield. Well, instead, when my 2 months were up, the Army decided that I'd had 18 months in the armored force, and I had a pretty good military background. Consequently, I ought to stay on at Camp Ritchie and be a teacher to train others how to be interrogators. So I became a real specialist in interrogation. I should point out here that in prisoner of war interrogation, there are 2 levels. One is tactical. That is interrogation done on the battlefield of soldiers taken prisoners in the course of battle. You interrogate them about their unit, their organization, that unit's plans, anything, any information you could get from the prisoner right there about that particular sector of the battlefront. The other aspect of interrogation is strategic. That is long-range intelligence at a much higher level, in which we're more interested about getting information about the overall battle plan of the enemy. That type of interrogation calls for interrogating only general officers and commanders of the troops. It also involved interrogating people high up in the government if and when they were taken prisoner. primarily it involved interrogating scientists who we thought would working on atomic research, chemical, bacterial warfare, the rockets, the rocket warfare, for which the Germans, of course, became very famous. Well, that was the interrogation level at which they placed me. And after teaching at Camp Ritchie for 10 months, I was sent overseas. And my assignment, when I arrived in France, in Paris to be exact, was to Louvain, which is one of the northernmost towns in France, northern France, right on the Meuse River. There we had a unit called 6824 DIC. DIC stands for Detailed Interrogation Center. We were in this little town, and our headquarters were in a hunting lodge in the Ardennes forest. And to this installation we brought officers, scientists, any kind of prisoner who had information on what you might call a strategic level, including those who had personal contact with Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, Goering, other high-ranking Nazis. As I said, we were doing political and strategic interrogation at this detailed interrogation center in France. My first job was to get in a Jeep with a driver with orders entitling me to travel anywhere on the Western Front, to travel to PW camps, prisoner of war installations where we had taken German prisoners of war, to find out which of these prisoners would have information on a detailed interrogation strategic level. And I would get to a camp, actually a PW enclosure, and on the basis of preliminary interrogation made by IPW teams, I would occasionally find a prisoner who had information on a strategic level. And we would bring that prisoner, as I say, a scientist or a medical officer or a general officer, to our detailed interrogation center in the Louvain for detailed interrogation on a strategic level. So my job was to travel all over the front, wherever there were prisoners, and to find people that we were interested in. Particularly, I was charged with locating a Nobel Prize winner physicist by the name of Heisenberg. Heisenberg was a Nobel Prize winner who we suspected was working on atomic research, and I was supposed to find his laboratory to find out how far the Germans had gotten in developing an atomic bomb. I never found him because actually we learned later that Heisenberg and his colleague, a man named Weizsäcker, Friedrich von Weizsäcker, were actually in Switzerland, and they were not working on atomic research. So that really was a mission that never materialized and failed. But we did have other prisoners that we were able to bring to the installation in Louvain. Incidentally, an interesting experience on the sideline here was, in the course of my travels around the various front, I learned that the 16th Armored Division, with which I had trained at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, was now with the Third Army heading toward Czechoslovakia. So since I had orders I could go anywhere I wanted to go, I thought it would be great fun to locate my division and reestablish contact with some of my former colleagues and friends. So my driver and I headed for Czechoslovakia. And we came to the outskirts of the Bohemian forest, not very far from a German village called Hof, H-O-F, where the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment was doing the reconnaissance for the 3rd Army heading into Czechoslovakia. There was a Colonel Reed, who was the commanding officer of that cavalry unit, who had asked me to do some interpreting for a particular prisoner, a German captain in the German Air Force, who had voluntarily surrendered and came to our installation, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and gave himself up voluntarily because he represented, belonged to a German intelligence unit, very much like the one we had in Ravin, France. This unit was gathering information about the Russians. They were also in, you might say, a hunting lodge, similar to the kind of facility we were in France. And they interrogated primarily Russian prisoners of war on the Eastern Front, who were brought there for detailed interrogation. The Soviet forces were about 10 miles to the east of this camp. We were about 5 miles to the west. And this unit now was concerned if the Soviet soldiers got to them first and found what they had been doing, gathering information, they'd really be in trouble. Furthermore, they didn't want to have any of the information that they had to fall into Soviet hands. So they voluntarily surrendered. They wanted to surrender to the Americans. So they sent this captain to the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, which was the most advanced unit of the 3rd Army. And this captain wanted to arrange a surrender of this service station, this intelligence unit, to the Americans. Consequently, since I spoke German, Colonel Reed ordered me to take a detachment, a truck and a jeep, to this camp and arrange for the surrender of the officers and enlisted men and bring them to the German installation as prisoners of war. That was an interesting adventure. The unit was commanded by a Colonel Holters, W. Holters, a lieutenant colonel of the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, who was the commanding officer of this German intelligence unit. The colonel surrendered his group. There were only a few officers and enlisted men, and all their documents we loaded on a truck. And they got on the truck, our 2.5-ton truck, and the colonel got into the jeep with me, and we returned to Schwarzberg, actually, right on the border of the Czechoslovakia and Germany. On the way, Colonel Holters asked me if I knew anything about horses. And I said, no, not really. I was mechanized cavalry, not horse cavalry. And I asked why. And he began to tell me in a very excited fashion about a stud farm, which was operated by the German Department of Agriculture, Ministry of Agriculture. And at this stud farm, they were breeding the Lipizzaner horses, the very famous Lipizzaner stallions, which performed at the Spanish riding school in Vienna, very famous going back to the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and a big tourist attraction in Vienna even today. Spanish riding school is extremely famous, and people come from all over the world to see these stallions perform. Well, the mares and stallions had been brought to the stud farm about 3 miles from where we were, actually 3 kilometers on the route where we were, going back to the American unit. Colonel Holter said that these mares and foals and some of the stallions would probably be captured by the Soviet armies as they advanced. Furthermore, there were a lot of Polish DPs, displaced persons, who were all over the neighborhood, and he was afraid of what would happen to these famous horses if they fell into the hands of the Soviets and the Polish DPs, who hated the Germans for obvious reasons. So I ordered my truck and the prisoners and documents to go on back to camp, and Colonel Holtis and I made a detour to this horse farm, a stud farm. It was quite a sight to arrive there on a May morning, actually the last day of the war, just before VE Day. It was this vast meadow with approximately 100 to 200 beautiful horses, mares, foals, and stallions, all Lipizzaner horses. It's quite a sight. I reported the location on our field telephone to Colonel Reed. It turned out that his brother had participated in the Olympics in 1936 against a Colonel, I can't think of his name right now, I'll think of a moment, who was the commander of the Spanish riding school. So he knew all about the Lipizzaner horses. Well, the outcome of it all was that Colonel Reed sent a tank battalion, light tank battalion, and some infantry to surround this stud farm, and we captured all of the horses and brought them across the border into Schwarzberg. Now, I say we, as the American Army did it. I didn't participate in the roundup. But I did have a chance to meet the commanding officer of the Spanish riding school. Colonel Pataisky was his name, I remember now. Colonel Pataisky, who was the commander of the Spanish riding school. The stallion, he told me, the stallions who performed, and only stallions perform at the riding school, had been brought from Vienna to Upper Austria, to an estate there in Upper Austria, western part of the country. And they were on a farm there, which was under the control of the 20th Corps, a commanding General Walker, who was actually billeted at that farm. General Walker invited General Patton to come and visit this farm, this estate where the stallions from the Spanish riding school had been brought as exiles. General Patton and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who was visiting, Deputy Secretary of War, who was visiting him at that time, flew from Frankfurt to this place in Austria. And this is when General Patton first learned about the Lipizzaner horses. A very interesting quote. They performed for him, they put on a show. General Patton was quite impressed. And a famous quote of his was, how many men were in charge of training these horses? And he was told that there were 58 of them. And Patton said, with expletives deleted, he couldn't understand how the German army could afford to have 58 healthy men teach horses how to dance instead of fighting at the front. That was his quote. Using 58 healthy men to teach horses how to dance. That was beyond his comprehension. Nevertheless, he gave an official order that all Lipizzaners, both those on the farm, the estate, where the mares were, and the stallions in Austria, were to come under the protection of the American army. And therefore, all the Pisanos were under the American Army protection and could not be touched by anybody anywhere. So Patton, of course, is very famous for liberating the Lipizzaner horses and is recognized for that. But I was the first American to see the horses on the estate. I'm trying to think of the name of the farm at the present time, but it's skipped my mind. But that was a side trip. I went back to Louvain with these prisoners, this Colonel Holters that I mentioned, and the documents. We took them to Louvain with us. And I arrived in Louvain on May 9th, the day after the armistice had been signed. Oddly enough, I had driven in my Jeep with my driver through Reims in France. The day that Colonel General Jodl was in Reims signing the surrender documents on VE Day. I didn't even know it. I had driven right past the little red brick schoolhouse where the surrender had been signed. And I arrived in Louvain not even knowing that the war had ended. But I arrived in time to participate in a small victory parade we had. Just a handful of officers and enlisted men of our detailed interrogation unit. And we had a parade through the town of Louvain to celebrate the end of the war. And that was on May 10th, 1945. A week or two later, my commanding officer called me in, and he said that we were about to close our installation in Louvain, and I was going to be transferred to another unit about which he knew absolutely nothing. He said, as a matter of fact, it was located in a place that he had never heard of before, called Luxembourg. He said I was going to a Central Continental Prisoner of War enclosure, number 32. And the military code name for that installation was Ashcan. And it was located in a little resort town, a health resort, a spa, called Mundorf-les-Bains, on the French-Luxembourg border in Luxembourg. He didn't know anything about what I would be doing there, but obviously it would be military intelligence work. So a week or two later, I think it was about 2 weeks later, I was assigned, yes, exactly, toward the end of May. I arrived in Mundorf-les-Bains. Now, I knew Mundorf very well. As a matter of fact, when Colonel Giannini told me that I was going to be transferred to Luxembourg, I didn't tell him that I was born in Luxembourg. That's where I wanted to go, because I knew the army. If I told him that, I'd have ended up in the Philippine Islands. So I kept quiet, with the result that I did come to Mundorf. And I knew it well because my family and I used to vacation in Mundorf when I was a boy. And I knew it as a place where a very lovely park, flowers and rose gardens, and a real health resort with swimming pools and mineral water. And Luxembourgers would go there to take the cure, to drink the mineral water and have massages and mud baths and everything else that pertained to regaining their health. I arrived in Mundorf-les-Bains at what was known as the Palace Hotel. It's a large 4-story structure. Around the hotel was a barbed wire fence about 10 feet high. On each of the 4 corners of that fence was a machine gun tower, 30 caliber machine gun, heavily armed guard, camouflage nets hanging on trees and bushes around the place. You couldn't see what was going on inside that enclosure from the outside. There were Klieg lights overhead, and what was obviously electric wiring running completely around the compound with a sign on it, danger, electric wire. I arrived at the gate, and the MP at the gate, American MP, stopped me, of course, checked my papers. And I had my orders to report to this Ashcan Special Detention Center. But I knew nothing about what was going on inside. And I asked the sergeant of the guard, with an MP vehicle, a Jeep, making the rounds. I said, "What's going on in there, Sergeant? What kind of a place is this?" And I've never forgotten his answer. He scratched his head and he said, "Look, Lieutenant," he said, "I've been here 3 weeks and I've never been inside. He said, all I know, to get in here you have to have a pass signed by God and somebody has to verify the signature." Well, I had the right papers because they let me in. And when I got inside, there's a young enlisted man who checked my orders and assigned me to my room number 30, I recall, in this hotel on the first floor. I went to that room, began to unpack my duffel bag, my belongings, and the room was a regular hotel room. This Palace Hotel was a luxurious hotel, which was a resort affiliated with the spa, with its health program. I was in the process of unpacking my belongings when I heard a knock on the door, and I thought this was one of the other officers, obviously coming to introduce himself. I went over, opened the door, and I had the surprise of my life, because before me stood none other than a man about 5'10" this way and about 5'10" that way, dressed in a natty gray uniform. He clicked his heels and bowed and said, "I'm Vice Marshal Hermann Goering." So I gave a very poor representation of an intelligence officer. I stood there with my mouth open. But I collected my wits and asked Herr Goering to step inside, which he did. And he came to introduce himself and to also find out who I was. He had seen me arrive through the grounds, the front gate, and the entrance, and he was curious in who I was. And he asked me, "Are you by any chance the welfare officer?" I was going to say, "I'm an intelligence officer, and I'm an interrogator. I'm to interrogate the prisoners here." Obviously, these were high-ranking general officers of the Nazi regime. But before I could really tell him that, he said, "Are you by any chance the welfare officer who will see to it that we all get a square deal and we get treated properly?" And in a rare moment of intuition, I said, "Yes, I'll see to it that you get treated properly." That's really all he wanted to know. He said, well, we would be seeing each other. He clicked his heels and went back out. And now I was very curious about what kind of an installation this was. Obviously, I was going to be continuing interrogation at strategic level, interrogating general officers, of whom obviously Goering was the highest as a Reichsmarschall. But I knew then that I was in for an exciting experience. But I still didn't know who the other prisoners were. At that time, the installation was just getting started, and a lot of them hadn't arrived yet. I reported this conversation into my commanding officer. My superior officer was Captain Sensenik. And I learned more about this organization. Special Detention Center, Ashcan, was to be a special center of interrogation for the high-ranking Nazis in order to determine who the first 22, or whatever number it turned out to be, would be to be tried at the famous Nuremberg war crimes trials. I learned that we really knew very little about the Nazis, about the Nazi organization. We didn't know what an Obersturmbannführer was. What were these Nazi organization ranks? What were the duties of these Nazi leaders with these high-sounding titles? The Führer, of course, being the head, and all these others coming down the line. What was the function of the SS? We didn't really know much about it. What was the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts? Who were these paramilitary organizations, like the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the German Labor Front, and also the Reichsarbeitsdienst, actually the labor service, and then there was the Reichsarbeitsfront, which is sort of a government union, a labor union. There were these paramilitary organizations like the NSFK, the National Socialist Flying Corps, the National Socialist Motor Corps. What were they supposed to do? How did they function? Who ran the concentration camps? Who made the decisions? We didn't know any of that stuff. So we didn't know who the arch criminals really were, who were to be tried at the first session of the tribunal. So the Nazi War Crimes Commission, which was headed by our Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, located in London and also in Paris, they decided that before we could bring the Nazis to trial at Nuremberg, we had to know more about them, their personalities, their characteristics, and who did what, who gave what orders, who was responsible for what crimes against the peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. That is why they were all being brought together in a secret location, top secret location, during the summer of 1945, to be interrogated to find out who's who. There were 5 military intelligence officers, all trained at Camp Ritchie, Maryland, in interrogation prisoners of war. I was one of them. The guard element of this installation were members of the 391st Anti-Aircraft Battalion. They were soldiers who fought in the North African campaign and also in Germany, and now were specially trained to be the guard element for this prison. They were outside. We also had 42 ordinary German prisoners of war, PW, who had been specially selected from PW camps. They were carpenters, electricians, bakers, cooks, a doctor, even a hotel manager. There were 42 of them, and they were brought to operate this installation. They were brought to Mundorf for that reason, which was kind of ironic. Here were the German soldiers, now PW, whose superiors were these Nazi leaders, generals and field marshals, who were now prisoners of war. And they were the cooks and bakers and electricians and hotel managers who were to take care of them. So we had the guard element, 391st. We had these German PW who were the management and the workers. And we had the 5 military intelligence officers and enlisted staff who would interrogate them. The prisoners were housed on the 4th floor and the 3rd floor in the ordinary hotel rooms, but the hotel furniture had been taken out, replaced with an army cot, straw mattress, 2 or 3 GI blankets, a bucket of water, cake of Lifebuoy soap, a table and a chair. That was the furnishing. They didn't have any of that luxurious hotel furniture. That had been taken out. They lived on the third and fourth floor. They had the freedom to go all over the hotel. They could visit each other in their rooms. They could come and visit us. The 5 intelligence officers were on the first floor of the hotel. The second floor was empty. It was a buffer zone. The third and fourth floors housed the prisoners in their hotel rooms. The ground floor was a dining room, a living room, a lounge, a veranda completely around the front of the hotel where the prisoners could sit, sunbathe. They could walk in the hotel gardens within the barbed wire enclosure. So they had the freedom to go all over the hotel, which is how Goering could come to my room and knock on the door and introduce himself when he saw me arrive. And that was all by design. We wanted them to talk to each other, to visit each other, to get into arguments, to stimulate conversation, because that helped interrogation. Okay? What was the interrogation like? We worked for the Nazi War Crimes Commission, as I said. They would send us questionnaires, a list of questions about each prisoner that they were interested in. And our job would be, we would have a staff meeting every day. And we'd look at the questionnaires. And then it would be decided which of the 5 of us would interrogate that particular prisoner about whom we had received the questionnaire. When Goering came to my room, I reported that visit, of course, to Captain Sensnick that evening when we first met together for the first time. And he said, "So Goering thinks you're the welfare officer. That's great. That's your cover from now on. You be the welfare officer. It'll be your job to visit the prisoners in their rooms. Look out for their welfare. Make sure they have what they need, like toothpaste, toothbrush, shampoo, if they have anything like that. Talk to them. Win their confidence. Listen to their gossip. In addition to that, of course, I would be an official interrogator. I would also be interrogating a particular prisoner. And the way it worked is each one of us had about, maybe a dozen prisoners whom we regularly interrogated when we got a questionnaire or a brief or a visitor who wanted to interrogate them from another country. So each one of us got to know a dozen of the prisoners very well. We became specialists about them. But I got to know everybody because I had the good fortune to also be the welfare officer who would go to visit them and make sure that there was something they wanted that was legally available to them, that they would get it. For instance, at first some of the higher ranking officers were busy writing letters to General Eisenhower, to General Patton, to President Truman, and our job was to translate those letters into English and send them out through channels. These were letters of complaint. We would write to General, for instance, Admiral Dolibois would write to President Truman to complain about the way he was being treated. After all, he was a 5-star admiral, and he should be treated like an admiral, not like a prisoner of war. They wanted to write letters to their parents, to their wives, to their families, to their children. And as a welfare officer, I would see that those letters got into the mail and got to their families. That was all part of the intelligence gathering. Of course, we read the letters too, gathered information about them. So I made the rounds every day. And I got a lot more information than the other prisoners because I got all the gossip, what they said about each other. Everybody was out to save his own neck. Everybody was out to look out for his own interests, to stress how important they were, or, if they were smart, how unimportant they were, that they really didn't know anything. They had nothing to say. We capitalized on all of that. Well, who were these prisoners? I said that they had the freedom to move around, visit each other, talk to each other. But as always happens, they divided into cliques, three distinct groups, three groups. And they ate together, usually by those groups. When they went to the dining room downstairs and they would serve their meals, they were sitting together. When they sat on the veranda, they always sat together in groups, mostly. What were these groups? On the one hand, we had members of the German General Staff. This was the elite military command of the German army. The highest of them was General Field Marshal Keitel, Wilhelm Keitel. Keitel was the chief of the Armed Forces High Command. That's the equivalent to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell. The equivalent to Colin Powell in our time then was General Keitel. He was the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, chief of the Armed Forces High Command. Under him was Jodl, Generaloberst Jodl, Alfred Jodl. Under him was Walter Warlimont, Lieutenant General, the equivalent to Lieutenant General. His title was General of the Artillery. He was in charge of the deputy in charge of operations. Then there was Field Marshal Kesselring, who was the commander of the German troops in Italy, and then the commander of the Western Front during the time of the Battle of the Bulge. Von Rundstedt, the leader of the Battle of the Bulge, known as the Rundstedt Offensive. The Grand Admirals, Grand Admiral Raeder, the Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy.
So the admirals were another clique.
They were all part of the German General Staff.
I'm still in that clique.
Yeah.
Okay.
These were all the elite high command. Their uniforms always bore the broad red stripe down the side of the trousers. And they had the red decorations and, of course, the symbols. A General Field Marshal was a 5-star general, the equivalent to a 5-star general. That was the highest rank, except Goering, who was a Reichsmarschall. He was over them all. He'd be the equivalent to about a 7-star general, if there were such a thing. But that title was a title he gave himself, with the approval of Hitler, Reichsmarschall, in charge of all of them. But he was not a member of the German General Staff because he was not a professional soldier. German General Staff were, you might say, the equivalents to our West Point graduates, or Air Force Academy graduates, or the Naval Academy. They were the professional career officers. They ran the German army. And the admirals and generals were part of that German General Staff. That was one group. They wanted nothing to do with some of the other prisoners, and vice versa. The second group was the real Nazi element. Probably the most notorious of that group would be Julius Streicher. Streicher was the Jew baiter. He was a Gauleiter of a state of Franconia. Streicher was a Jew hater. He was very proud of the fact that he was a racist. He called himself the leading racist of Germany. He was a publisher and editor of this pornographic anti-Semitic newspaper called Der Stürmer.